Life sometimes throws us into situations we could never anticipate, where the line between right and wrong becomes blurred. A quiet Saturday afternoon unexpectedly turned into a whirlwind of emotions, sparked by an old skirt and an unplanned visit. This isn't just a family story, it's a journey of confronting tangled feelings and finding a way to uphold personal values. This tale will make you pause and reflect on the boundaries in relationships. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story. If you found it interesting and meaningful, please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Your support is the inspiration for us to continue creating high-quality content. It all began on an unremarkable Saturday afternoon. One of those days where time seemed to flow lazily, like the steady hum of the dryer in the background. The house was calm, bathed in soft sunlight streaming through the windows, casting warm patterns on the floor. I was in my bedroom, half-heartedly sorting through my closet, sifting through clothes I hadn't worn in years. It wasn't exactly the most exciting way to spend the weekend, but it gave me a sense of accomplishment. A small win against the clutter that seemed to creep into every corner of my life. As I worked through the hangers and folded clothes, my fingers brushed against something familiar. A fabric that seemed to pulse with memories. I pulled it out, a tiny, faded mini skirt. It was a relic from another era. One that felt both distant and oddly close. Back then, this skirt was a staple of my wardrobe. A symbol of youthful exuberance, carefree nights, and a confidence that felt effortless. I smiled to myself, feeling a wave of nostalgia. How long had it been since I'd worn something like this? Years. Probably. I had convinced myself I'd outgrown those days. That my current self didn't belong in the same world as the girl who used to twirl around in that skirt. But something about that moment felt different. On a whim, I decided to try it on. As I slipped it over my hips, I felt a mixture of curiosity and humor. Would it even fit? The fabric clung to me, tighter than I remembered. But it still fit, barely. When I turned to the mirror, I burst into laughter. It was snug in ways I hadn't anticipated, accentuating curves I hadn't paid much attention to in years. Yet, for all its imperfections, it stirred something inside me, a faint echo of the person I used to be. Just as I was caught in that moment of self-reflection, a sharp knock at the door shattered the quiet. Startled, I glanced toward the hallway, my heart skipping a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. My hair was a mess. And my outfit, well, let's just say it wasn't something I'd wear to greet company. I hesitated for a moment before making my way to the door, still chuckling at the absurdity of the situation. When I opened it, there stood Samuel, my nephew. Only, Samuel wasn't the lanky teenager I remembered. At 22, he had transformed into a man, broad shoulders, an easy smile, and an air of confidence that made him seem older than his years. He was holding a bag of tools, his casual demeanor contrasting with my flustered state. "Auntie, you called about the leaky faucet. Remember?" he said, his tone light and familiar. "Oh, right. The sink in the guest bathroom. I had completely forgotten I'd asked him to stop by and fix it." Embarrassed, I laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Of course. Come on in. The bathroom's down the hall." Samuel stepped inside, his movements unhurried as he scanned the room briefly before heading to the bathroom. For a fleeting moment, I thought I caught him glance at me, a quick, subtle look that seemed to linger just a second too long. But I brushed it off, chalking it up to my imagination. As he worked on the faucet, I returned to my closet, trying to focus on the task at hand. But there was an unfamiliar tension in the air. One I couldn't quite place. It wasn't uncomfortable. Just different. I found myself acutely aware of his presence. The occasional sound of metal tools clinking against the sink reminding me he was just a few steps away. A few minutes later, as I walked past the bathroom on my way to the kitchen, Samuel called out to me. "Hey, Auntie. Can you come here for a second? I think I need a hand." I paused, setting down the cup of tea I'd just made. "Sure," I replied, heading toward the bathroom. Samuel was crouched by the sink, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing forearms tanned and defined from years of working with his hands. He looked up at me, his face lit with that familiar boyish grin, and motioned toward the faucet. "The pipe's stuck. Can you hold this while I try to loosen it?" "Of course," I said, stepping into the tiny bathroom. As I leaned in to grab the faucet, I realized just how close we were. The space was cramped, forcing us to stand shoulder to shoulder. The warmth of his arm brushed against mine as he worked, his focus shifting between the stubborn pipe and my hands. At one point, I glanced at him, only to find his gaze flicker toward me. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it left me with a strange feeling I couldn't quite name. His expression was thoughtful, as if he were trying to decipher something. I shook the thought from my mind, telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the moment. But as the minutes passed, that unspoken tension lingered, weaving itself into the small, shared space between us. It wasn't something I could explain, and I wasn't even sure I wanted to. All I knew was that this Saturday afternoon, which had begun so ordinarily, was shaping into something entirely unexpected. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice cutting through the dense silence that had settled between us. He looked up at me, his hands pausing mid-motion on the pipe he was working to loosen. For a fleeting moment, his eyes met mine, and I caught a glimpse of something, hesitation. Maybe. It was so quick that I wasn't even sure it had been there. Then, just as quickly, his usual easygoing grin surfaced, smoothing over any tension. "Yeah," he said, his voice light, almost too casual. "Just trying to make sure I don't mess up your sink. Wouldn't want Auntie to kick me out over bad plumbing. Right?" I chuckled, but it came out nervous, forced. "Well, you're the expert, aren't you? No pressure," I teased, trying to diffuse the strange atmosphere. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken lingered in the air. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than felt necessary before he turned his attention back to the pipe. Minutes passed in silence, save for the occasional clink of metal tools. Finally, with a triumphant twist, he loosened the pipe and stood, brushing his hands off on his jeans. "There we go. All done. Should be good as new." "Thanks," I said, aiming for casualness, though my words felt stiff. "You're a lifesaver." Samuel leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he studied me with a look I couldn't quite place. His expression seemed equal parts curious and amused. "You know," he began, tilting his head slightly, "I don't think I've ever seen you wear something like that before." The comment caught me off guard. And I froze. Heat creeping up my cheeks. My fingers instinctively tugged at the hem of the mini skirt I'd thrown on earlier without much thought. Oh. This? I forced a laugh, hoping to mask my discomfort. It's just something I dug out of the back of my closet. I was going to donate it. Samuel didn't respond immediately. His eyes flickered, like he was weighing his next words. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost contemplative. Well, it looks good on you, he said, his tone carrying an unfamiliar warmth. Thanks, I mumbled, avoiding his gaze as my cheeks burned. I guess. An awkward silence stretched between us, and the air felt heavier somehow. Needing to escape the moment, I turned quickly and stepped out of the bathroom, my mind racing. But before I could make it far, I heard his footsteps trailing close behind. "Auntie," he called softly, stopping me in the hallway. I turned to face him, my heart hammering in my chest. "Yeah." He hesitated, as if wrestling with something he wasn't sure he should say. Finally, he exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You ever feel like things happen for a reason?" His question threw me off. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. Samuel opened his mouth as if to explain but seemed to think better of it. With a rueful smile, he shook his head again. "Never mind. Forget I said anything." But it was impossible to forget. The look in his eyes, the strange tone in his voice, it lingered in my mind long after he'd left. That evening, I curled up on the couch, the television droning in the background as I mindlessly flipped through channels. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, dissecting every word, every glance. Was I overthinking it? Probably. After all, Samuel was family. Nothing more. Nothing less. Still, the unease refused to fully fade. Just as I began to convince myself it was all in my head, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting me from my thoughts. I leaned over, picking it up, and my breath caught when I saw the sender, Samuel. "Hey, Auntie. Can I ask you something?" The message popped up on my screen, and I stared at it, hesitating. Something about the timing struck me as odd. Samuel rarely texted me out of the blue, and when he did, it was usually for something casual, a quick check-in or a random question. But this felt different, heavier somehow. Why was he reaching out now? After a moment of deliberation, I finally typed back, "Of course. What's on your mind?" The reply came almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting, phone in hand. "I just keep thinking about today. You looked different." It surprised me, I guess. I frowned at the screen, a strange unease settling in my chest. What did he mean by different? My stomach tightened as I read his words again, trying to decipher the underlying tone. My fingers hovered uncertainly over the keyboard before I settled on a neutral response. "Well, I was just trying on old clothes. Nothing serious." As soon as I sent it, I saw the little typing bubble appear. It lingered there for a moment, disappearing and reappearing, as though he was struggling to find the right words. When his message finally came through, it caught me off guard. "You looked really good. I mean it." The air seemed to still around me. I blinked at the screen, rereading the words, my heart racing faster with each pass. Was this just a harmless compliment? Or was there something more lurking beneath the surface? I couldn't decide. My mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Finally, I typed back, trying to keep things light. "Thanks, Samuel. That's sweet of you to say. I hoped that would be the end of it. A simple compliment. Acknowledged and moved on from." But even as I hit send, a sinking feeling told me this wasn't over. His response came quickly, each word pushing the boundaries of what felt acceptable. "I don't know if I should say this, but I felt something today." "Did you?" My breath caught. The words stared back at me, stark and uncomfortably intimate. This was crossing a line, stepping into a place neither of us should be treading. Samuel wasn't just anyone, he was my nephew. My nephew. Whatever he thought he was feeling, it wasn't right. And yet, instead of shutting it down immediately, I hesitated. Maybe it was shock. Or maybe it was a misplaced sense of not wanting to hurt him. Either way, my fingers hovered, frozen, as I struggled to find the right thing to say. Before I could type a response, another message appeared. "Forget I said that. I don't want to make things weird." I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me but not quite dispelling the discomfort that lingered. This was a misunderstanding, I told myself. He'd move on. Things would go back to normal. But as I set my phone down, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that this was just the beginning. The next morning, I was mid-sip of my coffee, my hair still tousled from sleep, when a knock echoed through the quiet of my apartment. The unexpected sound jolted me, my heart skipping a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. Setting my mug down, I crossed the room and opened the door. And there he was. Samuel stood in the doorway, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like the same young man I'd seen 100 times before. But something about his expression was different. His usual carefree smile was gone, replaced by a seriousness that didn't belong on his face. "Samuel," I said, my voice tinged with surprise. "What are you doing here so early?" He shrugged, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by." I frowned, closing the door behind him. It was a flimsy excuse. Samuel didn't live anywhere near my neighborhood. He knew it. And so did I. But I didn't press him on it. Instead, I followed him into the living room, where he sank onto the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The room felt heavy, the silence between us thick and taut, like a thread pulled too tight. I stood there, uncertain whether to sit down or keep my distance. He looked up at me then, his eyes holding a weight I didn't recognize. "I couldn't stop thinking about yesterday," he said finally, his voice low but steady. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "Samuel." He held up a hand, cutting me off. "I know what you're going to say. I get it. I needed to see you, to talk to you, to figure out what this is." My breath hitched. Whatever this was, it was spiraling into something neither of us were prepared for. "Is everything okay?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him. My voice was steady, but my heart was anything but. The air between us felt heavy, weighted with unspoken tension. Samuel looked up, his eyes locking onto mine with a mix of uncertainty and determination. "About last night," he began, his voice quieter than usual. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I exhaled softly, the relief washing over me like a wave. At least he was acknowledging it. It's okay, Samuel, I replied, attempting to keep my tone light. Dismissive even. Let's just forget about it. All right, . But he shook his head firmly, his brows furrowing. I can't just forget about it, Auntie. His words carried an edge of urgency that made my chest tighten. I meant what I said. I froze. The air seemingly sucked out of the room. This wasn't what I'd expected. Not what I was prepared for. My mind raced as I grasped for the right words to defuse the situation. This wasn't how family, how anyone, was supposed to speak to each other. Samuel, I began cautiously, carefully picking my words like someone navigating a minefield. I think you're confused. Whatever you're feeling, it's not real. It's just. It is real, he interrupted, his voice rising just enough to convey conviction without aggression. His gaze bore into me, unrelenting and vulnerable all at once. I know it's wrong. And I've been trying, believe me. I've been trying to push it away. But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't. My pulse quickened, the weight of his words settling heavily in my chest. A tempest of emotions churned inside me, shock, confusion, guilt. How had we reached this point? Where had things gone so astray? Samuel, I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to remain composed. You need to stop this. You're my nephew. This isn't right. It's not fair to either of us. He nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, his eyes dropping to the floor as though he couldn't bear the weight of my gaze. I know, he murmured, his tone tinged with both shame and longing. I know it's not right. But keeping it in was tearing me apart. I needed to tell you. Even if it changes everything. For a moment, silence blanketed the room, save for the soft, steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I couldn't think, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words I wanted to say were lodged in my throat, tangled with the complexity of the situation. Finally, I rose to my feet, the need for space overwhelming. Samuel, I think you should leave, I said, my voice quieter now, almost breaking. We both need time. Time to process this. To think. He looked up at me, and the raw emotion in his expression was almost too much to bear, regret mingled with a flicker of something deeper. Something that scared me. All right, he said softly, standing up. His movements were slow, reluctant, as if leaving meant letting go of something he wasn't ready to lose. But this isn't the last time we're going to talk about this. I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. He walked out without another word, the sound of the door closing behind him leaving an echo that seemed to reverberate through the room. Relief washed over me, but it was accompanied by a gnawing unease that refused to be ignored. The late evening sun bathed the living room in a soft, golden glow, casting long, slanting shadows. As I turned toward the door, a glint of white caught my eye. An envelope, its corner barely peeking out from under the doorframe, seemed to beckon me. My heart skipped a beat. I knew who it was from before I even bent down to retrieve it. The envelope felt heavier than it should, weighted with the significance of its contents. My hands trembled as I opened it, the paper inside crackling softly. The handwriting was unmistakably Samuel's, neat, deliberate. Each letter painstakingly formed as if he'd rewritten it in his mind 100 times before committing it to paper. The note read, "Auntie, I know you asked me to leave. And I respect that. But I can't pretend these feelings don't exist. I've fought them. Tried to bury them. But they keep resurfacing no matter what I do. I'm not asking for anything, I wouldn't put you in that position. I just needed you to know the truth. If you want me to stay away, I will. Just say the word. And I'll disappear from your life completely. But if there's even the smallest part of you that feels the same, even a fraction, please, let me know. I'll be waiting." The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. My chest felt tight. Each breath a struggle as I tried to process the depth of his confession. The note slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the floor. The faint ticking of the clock growing louder in the suffocating silence. I stood there, staring at the words on the note. A tangle of emotions tightening in my chest. Should I feel angry at the audacity? Flattered by the sentiment? Or scared of what this might lead to? My thoughts spiraled, colliding in a storm of confusion. Was this a joke? A moment of misplaced courage? Could he truly mean what he'd written? And why? Despite my better judgment, did a part of me hesitate to dismiss it outright? The note felt heavier than paper in my hands. And after a moment's pause, I folded it with a deliberation that betrayed my unease. I shoved it deep into a drawer, as if burying it would also bury the turmoil it brought. But the truth gnawed at the edges of my resolve. It wasn't gone. It lingered in the corners of my mind, refusing to be ignored. I told myself I wouldn't respond. That silence was the shield I needed to protect us both. Yet, deep down, a persistent whisper reminded me that this was far from over. Later that night, as I lay in bed seeking refuge in sleep, the soft vibration of my phone shattered the quiet. My pulse quickened as I glanced at the screen. Samuel. His message read, "I know I said I wouldn't bother you. But I need to know. Did you get my note?" I stared at the glowing words, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, torn between ending this now or unraveling it further. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I typed a reply, "Yes. I got it. But Samuel, this has to stop. It's not healthy for either of us." The response came almost immediately, as if he had been waiting, breathless, for my reply. "I'll stop if you want me to. Just tell me honestly, do you feel anything for me? Even a little?" My fingers hesitated over the screen, trembling with the weight of the decision. Every possible answer seemed like a wrong turn. Admitting anything would fan the flames. But denying it outright felt like a betrayal of the complexity of the situation. At last, I typed what I thought would put an end to it, even if it left me hollow. "Samuel, you're my nephew. That's all I can say." I hit send, my chest tightening as I imagined his face on the other side of that message. I knew it wasn't what he wanted to hear, but it was the only truth I could offer. The next morning, I woke early, driven by an urgency to leave this tangled mess behind, even if only temporarily. Work, my safe haven, promised a few hours of clarity and distraction. As I walked into the office, the familiar hum of computers and muted chatter greeted me. It was a place where the boundaries were clear, where personal entanglements had no room to intrude. But as I settled at my desk and began sorting through the flood of emails, an odd sensation pricked at the back of my neck. It was that unmistakable feeling of being watched. Slowly, I lifted my gaze toward the window, and froze. Samuel stood just outside, his figure silhouetted against the glass. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his expression a mixture of conflict and resolve. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my ears as a cold dread settled in. What is he doing here? I muttered under my breath, panic rising. The sanctity of my work life felt violated. The fortress I had built breached. I excused myself, pushing away from the desk with an urgency that betrayed my calm facade. Stepping outside, I approached him, my steps brisk but my voice measured. "Samuel, what are you doing here?" I asked, the edge of my tone barely concealed. "I had to see you," he replied, his voice low yet steady, carrying a gravity that made my stomach churn. "You didn't answer my question last night." I inhaled sharply, forcing myself to maintain composure. "Samuel, I've already told you. This isn't healthy. We can't keep having this conversation." His eyes searched mine, desperate and unrelenting. "But you didn't deny it," he said, stepping closer, his voice softening but laced with urgency. "You didn't say you don't feel anything at all." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. My breath caught, and for a moment, I was rendered speechless. How could I explain the impossible tangle of emotions? The boundaries that could never, would never, be crossed? His gaze bore into me, pleading for something I could never give. I took a hesitant step back, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag as if it could somehow anchor me. "This isn't about feelings, Samuel. It never was. It's about knowing the line between right and wrong. And this, whatever you think this is, isn't just wrong. It's impossible." He exhaled heavily, dragging a hand through his already disheveled hair, the gesture raw with frustration. "Do you think I don't know that?" he asked, his voice trembling under the weight of emotions barely contained. "I've told myself that over and over. But telling myself doesn't stop it. I can't control this. I can't control how I feel about you." His words hung between us, a palpable tension that made the air thick and suffocating. I wanted to say something, to push back against the tide of his emotions, but I felt paralyzed. Instead, I turned, willing my legs to move, desperate to escape the conversation that was cutting into me like a blade. "Auntie, wait," Samuel said suddenly. His hand reached out and gently, yet firmly, caught my arm. I froze at the contact, every nerve in my body hyper-aware of the moment. Slowly, I turned my gaze downward, fixating on his hand before lifting my eyes to meet his. There, in his expression, was something that made my heart twist, raw vulnerability. A plea for understanding that I wasn't sure I could give. "I'm not trying to make your life harder," he said, his voice quieter now, almost breaking. "And I'm not trying to ruin mine either. I need to know if there's even a chance. Tell me there's not, and I'll disappear. You'll never have to deal with me again." His words hit me with a force I hadn't expected, leaving me breathless. The idea of Samuel disappearing from my life, of him walking away entirely, was almost unbearable. Yet I knew the truth. Letting this continue, letting even a glimmer of hope grow, would destroy us both in ways we might never recover from. "Samuel," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. Your family. That's all this can ever be. His face fell. The defeat in his expression pulling at something deep within me. For a moment, he looked as though he might argue. But then he nodded. His shoulders slumping as though he'd been carrying the weight of the world and had finally decided to let it go. Okay, he said simply. Stepping back. I hear you. I'll leave you alone. I watched as he turned and walked away. The ache in my chest growing with each step he took. Relief and sadness warred within me. Neither emotion winning. I thought that was it, the moment we'd needed to finally sever this tangled connection and move forward with our lives. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Later that night, as I settled into the quiet comfort of my apartment, the weight of the evening still pressing heavily on my mind, my phone buzzed insistently on the coffee table. The screen lit up with Samuel's name. And my stomach twisted. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, bracing myself for whatever he might have to say. But it wasn't Samuel's voice on the other end. This is Mercy General Hospital, a woman's voice said briskly. Your nephew has been in an accident. He's asking for you. The words jolted through me like a lightning strike. What happened? Is he okay? I demanded, my voice rising with panic. He's stable, the woman replied, her tone calm but detached. It's best if you come in. I didn't ask for more details. My mind raced as I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door, the worry gnawing at me with every passing second. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Every red light and slow turn amplifying the anxiety clawing at my chest. When I finally pushed through the swinging doors of the emergency room, my heart was pounding. I scanned the bustling room, searching desperately until my eyes landed on him. Samuel was lying on a hospital bed, a small cut on his forehead and his arm immobilized in a sling. Relief flooded me at the sight of him alive, though it was quickly replaced by a sharp surge of worry. What happened? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended as I approached him. Samuel looked up at me, his face pale and drawn, but his lips curved into a weak smile. It's nothing serious, he said, his tone attempting to be light. Just a fender bender. Samuel, I said, exasperated. You had me worried sick. He chuckled softly, the sound more a grimace than a laugh as he clutched his side. I'm sorry, he said, the apology genuine. I didn't know who else to call. Those words struck a chord deep within me. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the lines we'd drawn and the boundaries I'd reinforced, he still saw me as someone to turn to in his time of need. And in that moment, as I stood there by his bedside, I realized that some connections, no matter how complicated, could never truly be severed. You're here now, I said softly, my voice betraying the mix of emotions surging within me. That's what matters. Samuel's eyes met mine, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated. Something I wasn't sure either of us were ready to face. I sighed deeply, dragging a chair closer to his hospital bed. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the room, mingling with the quiet hum of machines and the occasional murmur of distant voices in the hallway. I tried to steady my voice as I sat down. Well, I'm here now. Samuel, are you okay? Truly. He gave a small nod, his face softening. But there was something in his eyes that didn't match the gesture. A shadow of hesitation lingered. As if he were holding back. Yeah. But. His voice trailed off before he drew a breath and met my gaze with an intensity that made my chest tighten. There's something I need to tell you. I frowned. Leaning slightly forward. Samuel. Now is not the time. I said. My tone firmer than I intended. He shook his head. Cutting me off with quiet determination. It is, he insisted. His voice steady despite the vulnerability flickering in his eyes. Listen. I didn't call you here just because of the accident. I called you because I realized something I can't keep to myself anymore. I tilted my head. My brows furrowing. What are you talking about? He glanced down. His fingers absent-mindedly fidgeting with the edge of the hospital blanket. For a moment. He seemed younger. Like the boy I used to know. Before life had carved its struggles into him. When I thought I might not make it. All I could think about was you, he confessed. His voice soft but unwavering. I thought about how much I care about you. How much I've messed things up. And how terrified I am of losing you forever. Samuel. I began. But the words caught in my throat. Please, he interrupted. Raising a hand as if to halt my protest. His expression was raw. A mixture of desperation and resolve. Just let me finish. I know I've crossed lines. And I hate myself for it. But this isn't just some fleeting thing for me. I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone. And I know it's wrong. I know that. But no matter how hard I try, I can't make it stop. His words hung in the air between us. Heavy and charged. Filling the small hospital room with a suffocating tension. I wanted to speak. To respond. But I didn't know how. A part of me ached for him, for the pain etched in his voice. For the torment he clearly felt, but another part recoiled. Aware that no amount of sympathy could untangle the mess we were in. Before I could gather my thoughts. The door creaked open. And a nurse stepped in. Her professional smile polite but firm. Visiting hours are over, she announced. Her voice cutting through the silence like a lifeline. I exhaled. Relief and regret intertwining as I rose from the chair. Get some rest. Samuel. We'll talk about this later. I said. My tone gentler now. Though my emotions were anything but calm. He nodded. His eyes locking onto mine as though he feared this might be the last time he'd see me. I forced myself to turn and walk away. Feeling the weight of his gaze on my back until the door clicked shut behind me. The drive home was a blur. His words replayed in my mind. Looping endlessly like a haunting melody I couldn't escape. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. My thoughts a chaotic storm of confusion and guilt. Had I done the right thing by leaving? Was there even a right thing in a situation like this? When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house greeted me with an eerie stillness. The familiar comfort of home felt distant. Hollow. I stepped inside, kicking off my shoes. And that's when I saw it, a small package sitting squarely on the kitchen table. My name was scrawled across the top in Samuel's handwriting. My breath hitched as I approached it. My pulse quickening with a mix of dread and curiosity. The package was light. Unassuming. But the weight of what it might contain felt immense. With trembling hands, I peeled back the tape and lifted the lid. Inside, I found a letter folded neatly atop a small photo album. The letter began simply. But the words hit like a tidal wave. Auntie, it read. I know you asked me to stop. But I need to explain everything. Even if it's the last thing I ever say to you. Please read this and look through the album. After that, if you still want me out of your life, I'll understand and respect your wishes. I swallowed hard, unfolding the letter further as my eyes scanned the next lines. From the moment I moved back here, I felt something different around you. At first, I told myself it was just admiration. A kind of respect I hadn't felt for anyone else. But as time went on, I realized it was more than that. I know how wrong this must sound. I've tried to fight it, to convince myself it would fade. But it hasn't. You've always been there for me. Through everything. Even when I didn't deserve it. You've seen me at my worst and still cared. That's not something I take lightly. I paused, my chest tightening as I fought to steady my breathing. The words blurred slightly as tears threatened to fall. The album beneath the letter caught my eye. I hesitated before picking it up, unsure if I could handle whatever memories or confessions it might hold. Flipping it open, I was greeted by photos, snapshots of moments I'd long since forgotten or overlooked. Pictures of us laughing, talking, sharing quiet moments that had seemed ordinary at the time but now carried an unbearable weight. With each page, Samuel's words echoed louder in my mind, colliding with my own tangled feelings. My heart pounded as I reached the final page, unsure of what lay ahead, unsure of what I would do next. The weight of his words felt almost unbearable. Yet I couldn't stop reading. Each sentence pressed on me like a heavy stone, compelling me to confront emotions I hadn't even begun to untangle. I put together this album to remind myself of everything I love about you. Samuel wrote. Not in a way that crosses lines, but as a way to process my feelings. You'll find photos of us from family gatherings. Moments where you were laughing. Or just being yourself. I'm sharing this with you because I don't want to keep secrets anymore. I'll respect whatever decision you make. But I couldn't let this go unsaid. My hands trembled as I set the letter down and opened the album. The photos were immediately familiar, snapshots from family barbecues, holiday dinners, and random occasions that had slipped my memory. Each image felt like a window into the past, now illuminated with a different perspective. His small handwritten notes, carefully penned in Samuel's distinctive handwriting, accompanied each picture. They detailed things I had never noticed about myself, the joy in my smile, the kindness in my interactions with others, the quiet strength he admired. As I turned the pages, tears blurred my vision. The tenderness in his observations was overwhelming. A mix of something achingly pure and profoundly unsettling. It was as though he had taken the time to immortalize every small detail about me that I took for granted. This wasn't just infatuation, it was the raw, unguarded outpouring of his heart. I closed the album slowly, my mind spinning. For what felt like hours, I sat motionless, trying to process the gravity of what Samuel had shared. The lines between admiration, gratitude, and something deeper had blurred for him in a way that I couldn't ignore. But what could I do? Encouraging his feelings wasn't just unthinkable, it would shatter the delicate bonds of our family. Yet to completely shut him out felt equally cruel, especially when his pain was laid so bare before me. The sharp buzz of my phone jolted me from my thoughts. Samuel's message appeared on the screen. Short and filled with apprehension. Did you get the package? I just need to know you've read it. If you want me to leave, say the word, and I'll be gone by tomorrow. I stared at his words, My heart and mind locked in a battle that seemed unwinnable. Every decision felt weighted with consequences too immense to bear. Finally, I typed back, "Samuel. Come by tomorrow. We need to talk." The next morning, he arrived promptly. His face a mix of nervous anticipation and fragile hope. I invited him inside, and we settled into the living room, the space between us heavy with unspoken emotions. "Samuel," I began, my voice steady yet gentle. I read the letter and looked at the album. I can see the thought and care you poured into it. And I won't lie, it touched me deeply. But we need to talk about this honestly. And we need to set boundaries for both your sake and mine. He nodded, his gaze fixed on his hands. "I understand," he said softly. "I just needed you to know how I feel. That's all." "I know," I replied, leaning forward to meet his eyes. "And I need you to know that I love you too, but as family. That's where it begins and where it ends. The feelings you have for me, Samuel, they come from a place of admiration and gratitude. Those feelings are valid. But we can't mistake them for something they're not. Acting on them would only hurt both of us, and everyone we care about." Samuel's shoulders sagged as he absorbed my words. His face was a conflicted blend of relief and sorrow. "I get it," he murmured. "I don't want to lose you, Auntie. I'll work on letting this go." I reached across the space between us, taking his hand in mine and squeezing it gently. "You're not going to lose me, Samuel," I assured him. "But this is something you need to work through. For your own sake. Take time to figure out what's really in your heart. And maybe talk to someone, a counselor or someone you trust, who can help you navigate these feelings." He nodded. And for the first time in what felt like days, I saw a glimmer of peace in his eyes. We stayed there a while longer, shifting the conversation to lighter topics. He spoke about his plans for the future, his career aspirations, and hobbies he wanted to pursue. By the time he left, a weight seemed to lift, not entirely gone, but lighter. True to his word, Samuel gave us both space in the weeks that followed. He focused on himself, seeking professional help to untangle the complicated emotions that had brought us to this point. Over time, the strained undercurrent between us began to ease. Our relationship slowly returned to something closer to what it had been before, grounded in mutual care, familial love, and a deep, unspoken understanding of the lines we could never cross. After our heartfelt conversation, Samuel decided to take time to rediscover himself and confront the tangled emotions within him. It wasn't an easy journey, but I believe he will find the right path. For me, this was not just a lesson about setting boundaries but also an opportunity to understand and cherish family relationships on a deeper level. Life often challenges us with uncomfortable situations, but how we face them truly defines who we are. This story taught me that sincerity, empathy, and decisiveness are essential to resolving sensitive issues. When we place love and understanding above all else, even amidst confusion, we can find a way to peace. Set clear boundaries. Boundaries are crucial to protecting yourself and preserving your relationships with others. Communicate honestly yet gently. Address others' feelings with empathy while staying true to your values. Seek help when needed. Complicated emotions are best addressed with support from loved ones or a professional. The story may have ended, but the lessons remain as a reminder to me, and perhaps to you, that no matter how challenging things become, family is where we find comfort and strength. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you found it meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more heartfelt stories in future videos. See you next time.